All right, get ready. Someone sent us a ton of material about the Nuremberg celestial phenomenon of 1561.
Wow.
We've got modern research, historical analyses, even a study guide,
Yeah.
and a briefing document.
Sounds like someone's been busy.
Our mission, if you will, is to figure out what really happened in the skies over Nuremberg almost 500 years ago and why it caused such a stir.
That's a good one. Let's set the scene.
Okay.
Imagine it's just before dawn on April 14, 1561.
Okay.
Near Nuremberg, Germany.
Okay.
And suddenly the sky lights up.
Our main source is this broadside.
Oh, yeah?
Basically an early news pamphlet printed that same year in 1561
Right.
by a guy named Hans Glaser.
Okay.
And it features a woodcut illustration. Can you imagine that?
I can.
Showing all these spheres of red, blue, and black zipping around the sun.
Wow.
Then there are these cross-shaped objects like tubes and cylinders.
Interesting.
Some of them are even spitting out smaller spheres.
What?
It's wild, and presiding over it all is something described as a sun-like form.
Okay, so we've got the visuals, but what does the text actually say about it?
So both the broadside and some oral accounts that were recorded describe these objects as fighting.
Fighting, like battling it out.
Yeah, they're battling it out up there with some falling to earth and burning.
Really?
Yeah. And get this.
Okay.
The event supposedly lasted for an hour.
An hour.
That's a long time for any celestial display.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Meteor shower. Right.
Right.
It makes sense.
Logical.
But there are a few problems with that.
Okay.
The sources address those.
That's good.
So those falling and burning objects could have been meteorites or fireballs, sure.
Yeah.
And they could even be breaking apart in the atmosphere, which would explain some of that movement.
Right.
But typical meteor showers are over in minutes, not a whole hour.
That's true.
You'd also expect some serious sonic booms from something that big and fiery, right? Entering the atmosphere like that.
Yeah.
And where are the craters?
Exactly.
Nobody reported finding any impact sites or debris?
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
So if not meteors, then what else could it be?
Right.
Well, the sources offer up a few alternatives.
Oh, hey.
Like,
atmospheric phenomena.
yeah, things like sun halos or light refraction caused by specific weather conditions.
Like, how does that work?
Well, imagine sunlight interacting with ice crystals high in the atmosphere.
Okay.
That can create some pretty amazing colors and lights.
Interesting.
It's definitely beautiful,
Sure.
but it wouldn't explain those complex movements or shapes, especially those crosses we were talking about.
Right.
So maybe not a perfect fit.
So what about comets or comet fragments? Could those explain the long duration and that sun-like object?
It's possible. Imagine a comet breaking up as it gets close to the sun,
Yeah.
creating those smaller spheres and a central, brighter sun-like form.
It's a cool thought.
But again,
Yeah.
there's just no solid evidence to back that theory up.
So we've got a few possible natural explanations, but
But none of them quite explain everything.
yeah.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. You got to remember, this was the 16th century, you know?
Yeah.
People saw the world through a very different lens back then.
Right.
Religious beliefs were ingrained in society, so when something unexplained happened,
They turn to...
they often saw it as a sign from God,
So what we might see as a scientific puzzle, they might have seen
as a divine message.
Yeah, or even like a celestial battle
Ooh,
between good and evil.
that would definitely explain those descriptions of fighting.
And those cross shapes, too.
The symbolism.
It all makes sense when you consider that there wasn't really an in-depth investigation at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Scientific inquiry wasn't as
It's common.
as common, right?
Yeah. Plus, the church had a lot of influence on how people explain the world.
Yeah, and let's not forget about Hans Glaser, the printer.
Oh, right.
Broadsides were often,
Sensationalized.
sensationalized to grab attention.
Sell more copies.
Right. He might have exaggerated or emphasized certain details to sell more copies.
It's possible.
And here's a thought. Has anyone gone back to investigate those supposed crash sites with modern technology?
I mean, I don't know.
Like ground-penetrating radar or something?
The sources don't mention any modern investigations.
Oh.
And even if someone wanted to, where would they even start?
That's true.
The descriptions in the sources are so vague.
Right, they just mention locations outside the city.
And Nuremberg has changed a lot in 500 years.
Oh, yeah.
Pinpointing those spots would be nearly impossible.
Probably a real challenge.
It would. But you bring up an interesting point.
Okay.
What if those objects were actually metallic meteorites? They might have left traces that we could detect with that modern technology.
That's true, but we've also got to remember that most people back then couldn't even read or write.
Oh, right. So how was this event documented at all?
Well, it was probably a combination of eyewitness accounts that were passed on orally.
Right, word of mouth.
And the interpretation of someone like Hans Glaser, putting it all together.
It makes you wonder if there are other accounts out there.
Yeah.
Hidden away.
Right, in some archive.
Or personal diaries, church records, who knows?
Just waiting to be found.
It would be incredible to discover those.
It really would.
To hear those firsthand accounts.
Yes.
Unfiltered
Right.
by the printer.
And the need to sell papers.
Exactly.
Imagine the insights we could get.
Yeah, the nuances.
Yeah.
Of how people from different walks of life saw this event.
And maybe even get a clearer picture of what they actually saw.
Without Hans Glaser's spin on it.
Yeah, but speaking of how people perceived the event, the sources mention this fascinating detail. How did they estimate the duration of the event?
Oh, that's right.
They didn't have modern clocks back then.
No iPhones.
So how did they know it lasted about an hour?
It really makes you think.
It does.
Maybe they use natural cues.
Like
the position of the sun. Or the length of the shadows.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or maybe they relied on familiar time markers.
Okay.
Like church bells.
Right.
Or, just the routines of daily life.
Like imagine a farmer being like, well, the lights appeared just before I went to milk the cows.
Yeah.
And they were still there when I came back in.
That's possible.
But the sources also say that the concept of an hour back then might have been...
More symbolic.
Yeah, more symbolic than literal.
Like they were just saying, this event went on for a really long time.
Yeah.
To emphasize the unusual duration.
So maybe it wasn't a precise measurement.
Right.
But more a way to express how extraordinary the whole thing was.
Right. It really highlights how...
Subjective.
Yes, subjective perception and cultural context.
Can influence how we see things.
Especially when it comes to something as mysterious as the Nuremberg phenomenon.
And it makes you wonder about the role of storytelling in history.
Oh, yeah.
Hans Glaser's broadside, it was basically a story.
A narrative.
Yeah, to capture people's attention.
And imagination.
In that story.
With all the drama.
Yeah, the fighting objects, the burning.
Has stuck with us.
Yeah, for centuries.
Inspiring all these theories and speculation.
It reminds us that even the most carefully documented historical events are still filtered through the lens of...
Human perception.
Yeah, language.
And the culture of their time.
So much to think about.
So much.
What were those people really seeing?
Here's the question.
And how much of it was shaped by their beliefs?
Their fears.
The way they understood the world.
It's like peeling back those layers.
Of time.
And perception.
Trying to get to the truth.
But before we get too philosophical here.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears and talk about the connection between those 16th century accounts.
Okay.
And modern UFO sightings.
Yes.
We've touched on it a bit.
Yeah, the similarities.
But there's a lot more to unpack.
Right.
It's a connection that might offer some surprising insights.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, those descriptions of fighting objects and things falling and burning are definitely dramatic.
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to picture, like
Right.
a scene from a movie.
Yeah, totally.
We have to remember, though, that those people didn't have the same frame of reference that we do today.
That's a good point. They didn't have sci-fi movies.
Right. So the question is, how do we interpret those descriptions? What do they actually see?
Well, the sources suggest that fighting they're talking about could be a misinterpretation of natural phenomena, like a meteor shower where the fragments break apart and it looks like they're, interacting.
Like they're battling it out up there?
Yeah. The sources also mentioned something called sundogs.
Oh, sundogs.
What are those? I'm not familiar.
Have you ever seen those?
I don't think so.
Imagine two bright spots of light
Okay.
flanking the sun, almost like phantom suns.
Hmm.
They're caused by sunlight refracting through ice crystals in the atmosphere. Yeah, under the right conditions, they could be super bright and create some really strange visual effects.
Wow. So maybe what they saw as fighting was just like a play of light and ice crystals?
It's possible, but there are other possibilities too.
No.
The sources point out that some comets can appear to fragment or shed material as they get close to the sun.
Oh, right. Right.
Can you imagine seeing that 500 years ago?
Without any understanding of what was happening.
Exactly. It would have been awe-inspiring
Oh, yeah.
and maybe even terrifying.
Yeah, for sure.
They might have seen those fragments as, like, individual objects moving on their own, maybe even fighting each other.
Oh, that's a cool thought.
And those fragments, they could also explain the tubes and cylinders spitting out smaller spheres.
Okay, that makes sense, but what about the falling and burning? That's even more perplexing.
It is. It's one thing to see lights in the sky, but something else entirely to see them fall to earth and burn.
Right, like it suggests something physical, right?
Something more tangible, yeah.
The sources mention meteorites as a possible explanation, and they talk about how meteorites can break apart in the atmosphere,
Which could
creating those dynamic movements and even smaller fragments that could look like they're being sped out.
it almost sounds like,
Like a rocket breaking apart.
yeah, or a satellite re-entering the
Oh,
atmosphere.
but there's a problem with that theory, right?
Yeah, the big one.
No impact craters, no debris.
If something that big and fiery actually hit the ground, we'd expect to find something.
Right, for sure.
And even if the objects burned up completely in the atmosphere,
Yeah.
we should still have, like, sonic booms or loud noises.
Exactly.
But the accounts don't mention any of that.
It's strange, isn't it? So maybe they weren't seeing physical objects at all? Maybe those descriptions were more like metaphors, ways of describing how the lights faded or disappeared from view?
It's possible. Remember, these accounts were filtered through their beliefs, their worldview.
Right, which was very different from ours.
What we might call a scientific phenomenon, they might have seen as something divine, something supernatural.
So we have a lot of possible explanations, but no clear answers.
It's a real mix. We have the meteor showers and comets,
Von dogs.
and possibly a lot of misinterpretation and symbolism influenced by their religious beliefs.
It's like a puzzle where some pieces are missing and others might not even belong.
That's what makes it so interesting, though.
Speaking of missing pieces, we were talking about how most people back then couldn't read or write.
Right, so how did those accounts even get recorded?
Good question. The sources suggest that Hans Glaser probably relied on eyewitness testimonies.
Okay.
Word of mouth, in his own interpretation.
So it's like a big game of telephone.
Yeah, details could have been changed or added with each retelling.
It makes you wonder what those original accounts sounded like.
I know, right?
Imagine hearing them describe what they saw with their own words, with all that emotion,
It would be incredible.
to get those firsthand accounts.
Unfiltered.
Without the printer trying to make a buck.
Imagine what we could learn.
About how people from different walks of life experienced this event.
And maybe even get a better idea of what they actually saw.
Without Hans Glaser's spin on it.
Right, and the sources bring up another interesting point.
Okay.
They talk about how the people in Nuremberg estimated the duration of the event.
Oh, right. They didn't have clocks back then?
No smartphones, no watches. How did they know it lasted about an hour?
It really is a fascinating question.
It is.
Maybe they used natural cues.
Like the position of the sun?
Yeah, the sun or the shadows.
Oh, interesting.
Or they could have relied on familiar time markers, like church bells.
Right.
Or just the routines of daily life.
Like, I started baking bread when the lights appeared and they were still there when the bread was done.
Exactly. But the sources also suggest that an hour might not have been a precise measurement.
Okay.
Maybe it was more symbolic, their way of saying this event lasted a really long time.
To emphasize how unusual it was. So it wasn't about being exact,
No.
but about expressing just how extraordinary the whole thing was.
Exactly. And that highlights how much.
Subjective perception.
Yes, perception and cultural context can shape how we see things.
Especially when it's something as mysterious as the Nuremberg phenomenon. And it makes you wonder about the role of storytelling in history.
Oh, yeah.
Hans Glaser's broadside was a story.
A narrative?
Yeah, meant to grab people's attention.
Their imaginations.
And that story with all the drama, the fighting objects, the burning.
It's resonated through time.
Yeah, for centuries.
Inspiring all those theories and speculation.
And it reminds us that even the most carefully documented historical events are still told through
A human lens?
our perceptions, our language, and the culture of the time. It leaves us with so many questions.
So many.
What were those people really seeing?
Right, and how much of what they reported was shaped by their beliefs, by their fears?
By the way, they understood the world back then.
It's like we're trying to peel back the layers of time and perception.
Yeah, to get to the heart of it all.
But before we go too deep into that rabbit hole,
Okay.
let's shift gears a bit and explore another interesting connection.
Okay.
The link between these 16th century accounts and modern-day UFO sightings.
Yeah, we've touched on the similarities.
But there's a lot more to discuss.
Let's get into it. All right, let's dive into those UFO connections.
Okay, so it's pretty fascinating how some of the shapes described back in 1561.
Yeah.
The spheres and the cylinders and even those tubes.
Yeah.
They sound a lot like some modern UFO reports.
You really do. Those spheres of red, blue, and black zipping around the sun.
Right.
Sound a lot like those Foo Fighters from World War II.
Yeah, those glowing orbs that pilots saw.
Right. And even today, people are always catching videos of weird glowing orbs in the sky.
All the time.
And what about those descriptions of cylinders spitting out smaller spheres? It makes me think of those tic-tac UFOs.
Oh, yeah, the ones the Navy pilots saw.
Those smooth, featureless things making crazy maneuvers.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable how similar they are.
Makes you wonder if there's something special about those shapes.
Right. Like maybe they're optimal for some kind of propulsion system that we don't understand yet.
Or maybe we're just wired to see certain patterns no matter what century it is.
That's a good point. And the sources do bring up perception and interpretation.
Right. We talked about those cross-shaped objects and how those might have just been a projection of their beliefs.
Exactly. And the same could be true for those other shapes.
So maybe those tubes and cylinders weren't actually physical objects?
Maybe.
Just how they tried to describe something they'd never seen before?
Right. Using the language and shapes that they knew.
Think about it. In 1561, they didn't have concepts like rockets or satellites or aircraft.
No.
So when they saw something strange in the sky, they had to rely on familiar things to describe it.
A tube or a cylinder might have been the closest thing they could think of.
Which makes you wonder if we're making the same mistake today.
How so?
Well, we see those tic-tac videos, and we immediately jump to advanced technology or alien spacecraft.
Because that's what we know.
Exactly, but the sources caution us about that.
Just because we can't explain something?
Doesn't mean it's aliens.
Right. We need to approach these things with a healthy dose of skepticism.
And look for both natural and maybe even unconventional explanations.
I think a multidisciplinary approach is key here.
What do you mean?
Well, we need historians to help us understand the context, scientists to analyze the data,
Okay.
and maybe even, some open-minded UFO researchers to bring those perspectives together.
It's like that story about the blind men and the elephant.
Oh, yeah.
They each feel a different part and come up with a completely different idea of what it is.
Right. We need to combine all the pieces to get the whole picture.
And maybe by studying these historical accounts with a modern perspective, we can learn something new about these unexplained things.
Whether they turn out to be natural or technological or something else entirely.
It's fascinating to think that those people in 1561 might have seen something that we're still trying to figure out today.
It really underscores the importance of keeping an open mind.
Questioning our assumptions.
And always looking for those missing pieces.
So, what do you think about all of this? The Nuremberg celestial phenomenon is a good reminder that even the most well-documented historical events can still be full of mystery.
Absolutely.
What stands out to you? Do you lean toward a natural explanation, like meteors or weather phenomena?
Or is there something about those shapes, the way they move, the lack of impact evidence, that makes you think it was something more unusual?
This deep dive has left us with more questions than answers.
Definitely.
Were those people witnessing something that science can't explain yet? Or was it all just a misinterpretation of the skies, shaped by their beliefs in the time they lived in?
Maybe one day we'll find new evidence, or look at it from a fresh perspective and get closer to the truth.
But until then, the mystery continues.